Well, good morning to every one of you. We have kind of a different topic this morning. Well, actually, this is one of two. I had 2 weeks before we jump into the book of Acts, and we're going to take a look at the Bible and science. Today, mostly stuff related to creation. Next week, mostly stuff related to the flood, Noah's flood, which according to the Bible had an impact on the entire globe, and there's a lot of evidence of that. So there's ways in which these things go together, and it's hard to talk about one without mentioning stuff from the other period, but I've got a lot of material to get through, and in many ways it's the tip of the iceberg. Those of you that are well versed in this kind of material will notice a lot of stuff that I just have to skip over. But I do want to leave a little time for Q&A at the end, hopefully if you've got some questions. So I'm just going to forge ahead here and see if I can't make a little time at the end. I might just start with a word about science. Theoretically, science is that which can be tested and observed and, what's the word I'm looking for? Repeatable. That's basic science. Now, of course, what we're talking about with origins is much more theory. Nobody amongst humankind observed creation, and there's no way in which creation, the origin of life, the universe is repeatable. So in a sense, what we're talking about connects to some aspects of science, observable stuff, but it's not science per se. Hopefully that makes sense. It's science in the looser sense of the word. So, let's begin with what the Bible says about the origin of the earth. First of all, Genesis chapter 1 in particular tells us that all creation was made by God in 6 days. And according to it would be fun just to take a couple of weeks on Genesis 1 because there's so much material there. But from the rest of the biblical text, we know that that includes everything other than God himself. It includes the angels, the heavenly realm where he now lives, the earth, and this vast universe that we see when we look out at night. Genesis chapter 1 repeatedly uses phrases like God made, and the phrase, he said, let there be. And I don't know of a more clear way to indicate he created stuff out of nothing. If that's what you wanted to say, that's how you would say it. So, very, very, very clear, I think. Each of the creation events are described as days, and more specifically, each references morning and evening. Again, I don't know how you could be more clear about the time frame than that. They didn't have 24-hour clocks yet, or I think he would have said that. But morning and evening is a day. And of course, they're assigned sequential numbers. The first day, the second day, the third day. On the seventh day, God rested from the work of creation. That's in the beginning of Genesis chapter 2. Interestingly enough, that became the basis for the Sabbath day which, according to the book of Exodus, it specifically imitates God's creative work. As God worked on 6 days and rested on the seventh, you are to work on 6 days and rest on the seventh. One of the reasons I mention that is because that doesn't make sense if every day was a vast age. Maybe you've heard of the day-age theory. But Exodus chapter 20 equates our week with God's creation week quite directly. It's God's creative work is the basis for our week, according to God himself. The text tells us that everything that was made was created by Jesus Christ. John chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, he was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. That seems quite clear. Colossians 1:16, for by him, and in the context again, this is Jesus Christ, by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on the earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. One final point here. I'm convinced the order of creation rules out any naturalistic or evolutionary explanation. And most specifically, let me put the days of creation up here. You'll notice that day 1 is the creation of the earth itself as a globe, water covered. Day 2 is the creation of the atmosphere. It would be fun to spend some time going through Genesis 1 with you. Day 3 is the creation of dry land and plants. What do plants need in order to survive? Light. Yeah, they operate off of photosynthesis. Yes, they need air and they need water and some other things like that too. But day 4 is the creation of the sun, the moon, and almost as a throwaway, he made the stars also on day 4. So the biblical text specifically rules out Big Bang, which would have the exact opposite order. The earth is basically last in the formation of plants and animals, the evolution of those things. If you're willing to take the text at face value, which I do. Okay. Second major point here, the age of the earth, according to the Bible does not state an age for the earth. One can go into the genealogies in Genesis chapter 5 and Genesis chapter 11 and add up the ages and birth dates of the various people there and arrive at a minimum date for creation. A lot of Jewish scholars and Christian scholars do that and come up with a date for creation around 4000 BC. That is based on the assumption that the genealogies are closed, that there are no skips or missing figures in there. And at face value, they read that way, I think. On the other hand, if you go to Luke chapter 3, verse 36, Luke inserts a dude in there by the name of Canaan, who is not mentioned there in the book of Genesis. And to me, that says the Genesis genealogies probably are not complete. That's not just me. A lot of folks, John Whitcomb, Henry Morris, a number of other biblical scholars that get into creation stuff believe the same thing. I didn't invent that. And if you want to believe that they're closed, that's fine. I won't argue with you. Without any gaps. It's another topic I could talk about at length. We have other genealogies in the Old Testament that clearly skip people and give highlights. We have some genealogies, for example, that cover the sojourn in Egypt that'll have a dozen names in them or more. A genealogy of that same time period in a different place that'll have like 4 names. Well, clearly that's not complete. They're hitting some highlights. So it's a whole large topic of discussion, and but anyway, before I get lost in that, so I think we can hit about 4000 BC as a minimum. A lot of what we would refer to as young Earth creationists would place the creation of the Earth in the 20 to perhaps 100,000 year range based on other things, archaeology, scientific evidence that we've got, but young anyway, at least by comparison with what evolutionary theory would tell you or suggest. But main point being, the Bible doesn't say this is how old the Earth is. Every indication is that it's young when you read the text. There's no indication of billions of years. But the Bible does not state a specific age, unless you try and calculate something. Okay, so switching gears a little bit, we talked some about what the Bible says. What evolutionists say, of course you're familiar with this, the origin of the Earth, the origin of the universe, a large explosion, which we fondly refer to as the Big Bang, right? Can't say it without smiling. Boom! And there randomly is life. Whatever. And they most commonly peg the age of the Earth at about 4.6 billion years. You go almost anywhere, any governmental site, any national parks website, go visit the Grand Canyon, anywhere you see secular theory on this, that's about the age they will assign to the Earth. That's a long time. By the way, do you know why they do that? It's driven by something, which is Darwin's theory. He theorized if it's possible for one animal to evolve into another animal, or from non-life to evolve into life, it would have to take a very, 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 very long time. So we need a lot of time. That's where these estimates ultimately come from. They don't come from scientific evidence. Now, you can make the evidence fit what you want. We know that. My dad has a geology degree from UNL. He had a prof that, I hope I get all the details here right. He had a prof, I got it from him, so that was part of the group that looked at numbers that came back from the first moon rocks that they tried to date. And according to him, what the computer spit out was a long list of possible dates, and someone had gone through and circled the ones that were right. And I can tell you, I do have a fair bit of study expertise with radiocarbon, which is a much shorter, younger testing system, and I can tell you the same kind of thing happens there. Dates that don't fit are easily thrown out, discarded, because they don't fit. Well, they must be an anomaly. There's a lot of ways to fudge numbers, and a firmly held belief can push you to do that kind of thing. So I'm getting off topic. I got to keep moving here. Some failures of evolutionary theory. A major one, in my view, is that it defies the second law of thermodynamics, which you probably haven't thought much about since high school. But in some, let me read a little bit here, just to get this perfectly correct. It states that any spontaneously occurring process, like not some person building something, but just spontaneous natural process, will always lead to an escalation in entropy, which is randomness disorder. It's the opposite of complexity in design. An escalation in the entropy of the universe. In other words, things fall apart naturally rather than evolving. And we see this every day. You look around. Have you ever seen a barn go the opposite direction? No, not by itself. If you put in enough energy and information, you can create something complex and something that works. But left to natural processes, this is not a theory, this is a law. Second law of thermodynamics. Naturally occurring events will result in entropy. Just another example. When I was a kid, put a lot of rock wall together down in Missouri, south of Kansas City. And between the rain and the wind and the snow and the goats, it would eventually end up like this. That's the second law at work. We even see that in ourselves. And evolutionary theory flies directly in the face of this, that you can get complex biological design by accident, by natural processes that do not involve the insertion of new information and, of course, energy. A second point is that evolution has no mechanism for the introduction of new information. Complex organisms imply design, which is the input of information by a designer, and that's something that Darwinism denies. You've all probably heard the watchmaker analogy. You look at something like this, and you immediately realize there's a designer behind this. This is not a random natural thing that somebody just found in the mud. This has been designed. Well, the exact same thing is true with living organisms. Again, I don't know how much you remember from science class. It would be fun to take a week and talk about the cell. This, in a way, looks like a colorful blob, but every item in there has a function and does amazing stuff, such that this is a living organism capable of reproduction. That does not happen randomly and on accident. And the reason is because packed into there is genetic code, which is not that different from what we do with computer design, except that it's a lot more complex. A lot of it we still don't understand. We're working on it. This kind of stuff was completely unknown to Darwin. In fact, a Catholic scientist, Michael Behe, wrote a book a few years ago called Darwin's Black Box. And he's talking about the cell, because to Darwin, it was just a box, and he could theorize anything he wanted to about it, and nobody could say any better. Now we know these things are immensely complex, and at their core are based on information, which I think is so fascinating because John 1 calls Jesus the Word. In the beginning was the Word. What is a word but information? And he created all of this. So I think this kind of thing shows us that there is a designer. There is very complex stuff within biology. We take it for granted, our ability to stand up from bed in the morning and walk around and we can see our toothbrush. We don't even think about it. But the amount of processes going on, the complexity that allows us to do those things is astounding and evidence of a designer. Another point I would put under there is this one, that half-formed organs, which Darwinianism suggests has been the case innumerable times. Half-formed organs are a liability, not an advantage, and according to Darwinism, ought to result in the death of that being. How do you get from a limb to a wing? Well, according to Darwinism, through a whole series of very gradual steps, a few of which are illustrated here. The problem with that? Halfway there is not really useful as a walking limb, and it's not useful for flapping. It doesn't have enough feathers to be useful for flight. So according to Darwinism itself, that creature ought to die because it's putting energy and effort, and blood flow, and all kinds of things into a limb that's not useful yet. In fact, you think of even when, according to Darwinian theory, it starts out as a little nub that just kind of sticks out of the flesh. Well, you're going to scrape that thing and injure the organism, and it has no use, right? So the whole idea of shifting like that and developing new organs very gradually defies logic. Third point, many biological systems are irreducibly complex. This was the main point of Michael Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box. He kind of coined that term, irreducible complexity, and the example that he used was a mousetrap. What's it got, like 5 different parts to it? Can you take one away and still have a functioning mousetrap? Of course not. Any part, I should say it this way, every part is essential. If you take away any part, it's only useful to throw in the trash because it doesn't function as a mousetrap. Michael Behe used that as an illustration with regard to the flagellum on a bacterial cell, the little outboard motor that propels it. It's actually very similar to what we would recognize as an electrical motor, and it's irreducibly complex. You cannot take away any single part from that and still have a functioning motor. So how do you get from not all of it to all of it? You can't get there in steps because it's non-functional, and it would be a detriment to the organism. And this again is on the molecular level, but we know that it's true with. You think of some organism like the eye, and how many different parts there are that have to be functioning correctly in order for you to have sight. It's an astounding number of things. The pressure, the clarity of the lens, the ability to contract and open, the eyelid blinking, the tear ducts, the nervous system. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. You take away any one of those parts, and it's a non-functioning eye. Sorry. You can't get there one piece at a time. Been through that. Yeah. Well, and in fact, our bodies as a whole, when you think about major organs, which one are you going to take? Well, okay, you might take away one kidney or something, or an appendix. Think of the major organ systems, though. I mean, it's the same thing. You have to have your lungs. You have to have your blood vessels, your blood system. You have to have your skeleton, you have to have your nervous system, your brain. I've sat on that long enough. A third point here, evolutionary theory is based on the assumption of uniformitarianism. You may have heard that phrase, the present is the key to the past. What we see currently going on is what has always gone on. And therefore we can deduce from what's currently happening, we can go backward and figure out how long it's been happening. Without it, there is no evolutionary theory, without uniformitarianism. If there's a break in processes, if something was different in the past, we would have no way of calculating backward or establishing that the Earth is millions, billions of years old. And in fact, uniformitarianism works against evolution. And let me throw some examples up here for you. And these are listed on your sheet. Ocean salinity, the salt content of the oceans. Ocean water is a lot saltier than the river water flowing in, but salt is slowly accumulating in the ocean. It's getting slightly saltier every day. So if we run that process backward, how long has the ocean been gaining salt at that rate? If you assume that the ocean started at a salinity of 0, no salt at all, the maximum age based on the current rate would be about 2.7 million years. That's assuming it was salt-free to start with and that the rate of salt input has always been the same. Now you might think, well, 2.7 million years is a lot older than what creationists teach. Okay, again, that's assuming that they were not created as salt water, but as pure, which I don't think is probably correct. And if the Earth is currently, if you assume the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, 2.7 is 0.0006% of that age. So it's almost nothing. So if the Earth is that old, why are the oceans not much, much more salty? I think it's a legitimate question. Of course, again, that's based on this idea of uniformitarianism, that it's always been the same. Comets, you may or may not know, are quite short-lived. They're continuously disintegrating. In fact, we see that last time Halley's came around, it was not much fun to see because it had disintegrated quite a bit. They are largely composed of ice. And every time they go around the sun, they heat up enough to shoot off a bunch of water vapor, and they're much smaller the next time they come around. There's roughly one comet a year that's visible to the naked eye, although they're usually not very spectacular. Quote here from Fred Hoyle I think is interesting. It's been estimated that the breakup of many comets is taking place at such a rate that they would be entirely disrupted, like there wouldn't be any more, within 1 million years. It's an immediate inference that these comets cannot have been moving around the sun as they were at present for much longer than 1 million years, since otherwise they would have already broken up. A scientist by the name of Jan Oort decided that there must be a celestial icebox of some sort from which these things are continuously being generated. Of course, there's no evidence for that. And it's a good question. They are so fragile and so short-lived. Why do we still have any if the universe, if our solar system is as old as Darwinianism would say? Atmospheric helium. Helium is a product of radioactive decay, specifically thorium and uranium. And a little bit of helium escapes into the outer space each year, but most of it stays in the atmosphere. They estimate 1/40th of the amount that's there escapes every year. If the Earth was billions of years old, we have about 1/2000th of the amount of helium that ought to be there. If you assume that our atmosphere began with 0 helium, the amount we have now would take about 2 million years to reach that. Again, that's the most conservative assumption you can make, that it started with none. For all we know, when God created the atmosphere, it had some. It's a natural element. Why don't we have more helium in the air than we do? The decay of the Earth's magnetic field. Since we began careful measurement in the early 1800s, it's decreased exponentially by about 7%. We estimate that its half-life is about 1,400 years, roughly. At that rate, the field could not be more than 10,000 years old. If you calculate, the Earth's magnetic field is weakening. If you go backward at the same rate, by the time you hit 10,000 years, it is so intense that you could not have life on Earth. The heat and the magnetism related to that would kill anything on Earth at about 10,000 years ago. Again, that's assuming that uniformitarianism is true. The current processes we see have always been the same, and you can calculate backwards. The Earth is uninhabitable 10,000 years ago, if you take a look at the rate at which our magnetic fields are decreasing. Radiocarbon in fossils. Radiocarbon, or C14, has a half-life of only 5,700 years, and after 100,000 years you should not be able to measure any. So if you begin with X amount, it decays, and in 5,700 years you have half as much. Another 5,700 years you have half as much. After 100,000 years, it's not detectable anymore. Any secular scientist would tell you that that's true. So how is it that we find carbon-14 in fossils, which are supposed to be millions of years old? Doesn't make sense, and we'll talk a little bit about that next week too, when we talk about the flood and the burial of these organisms, because I think it was the late 90s, we began finding soft tissue in dinosaur bones. What? This material that's supposed to be millions and millions and millions of years old has soft tissue in it? Somewhat similar to this. In fact, we can find carbon-14, detectable amounts of it, in diamonds. Diamonds are the hardest material on Earth. How do you get material in or out of a diamond? And yet they have detectable amounts of carbon-14 inside of them. Over 10 times the detection limits. Those things shouldn't be there at all if deep time is true. I'm going to throw up a rather complicated graph that's got too small of words to see. The colors of these dots have to do with the supposed period that they're from, the Cenozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Paleozoic. And across the bottom you can see how many millions of years ago those are, according to secular scientists. The interesting thing is that these all have radiocarbon in them, And you can see the radiocarbon dates up above, and essentially there's no difference in the amount of radiocarbon amongst these fossils, some of it coal, which is fossilized plant remains, no difference depending on the age. That shouldn't be if Darwinian theory is true. Just a couple of examples here. One's a fish, supposedly 40 million years old, and a carbon-14 date of about 26,000 years before present. Another one here. Again, this is the kind of stuff, if you enjoy this kind of material, the Creation Research Society puts out this kind of scientific stuff all the time, and it's quite fascinating. Creation Research Society Quarterly, CRSQ. Here's material from an extinct lizard, and I didn't put the date on there for you. Looks like that one's about 50,000 years before present, going by the radiocarbon dating. There shouldn't be, if evolutionary theory is true, there shouldn't be any radiocarbon in any of these fossils. It should have disappeared eons ago. Seafloor sediment accumulation. Every year, 20 billion tons of dirt and rock is washed into the ocean. And we think that about 1 billion tons of that, or about 5%, is taken out by tectonic movement. At that rate, the current thickness of the seafloor sediment would accumulate in less than 12 million years. Again, that's assuming that everything we presently see is the same process that's been going on the whole time, uniformitarianism. After 3 billion years, we'd expect to see 250 times more sediment than we see today. So where is all the material that's washed down? Kind of similar is the issue of landmass erosion. The Earth's surface is estimated to be eroding at about 2.4 inches per, not year, unless you're in the Dust Bowl, per 1,000 years. At that rate, the North American continent should be eroded flat to sea level in a mere 10 million years. So why hasn't it? We have rock layers that are much older than that, according to Darwinian theory. Why are they still here? At the present rate of erosion, they should have all disappeared a long time ago. Our continent should have eroded into nothingness. This is Kangaroo Island down on the southern side of Australia. And what's fascinating about it is that it's almost completely flat. There's very little evidence of erosion, and yet what we have almost at the surface are some very ancient rock strata. They do excavation there, pull fossils out. How can this be? If you would suggest that, well, the younger layers have eroded off, where's the evidence of erosion? There ought to be, and yet it's just this flat plane of very ancient rock material. It's kind of an enigma. We'll talk a little next week about some other evidences of the flood, which I think easily explains something like Kangaroo Island as well. I got to keep moving. This is my last one. Excess fluid pressures. We have abnormally high oil, gas, and water pressures in rock that is relatively permeable. Like, given enough time, the gas, the oil, the water should be able to make its way out of the rock. It's a very slow process, but we can measure it. If these fluids had been trapped more than 10,000 to 100,000 years ago, leakage would have dropped their pressures far below what they are today, which indicates that they must have been trapped suddenly and recently. Just as a couple of examples, 1910, the Lakeview Gusher in Kern County, California, drilling for oil, and they hit it, and what happens? Plume of oil, because it's under so much pressure. Some of these things were really dangerous because they'd light, and you got issues then. In fact, our next one, that happened too. At its peak, this particular one, more than 100,000 barrels of oil per day, shooting as high as 200 feet in the air. Point being, it's under a lot of pressure. It remained uncapped for 18 months, spilling over 9 million barrels of oil. What a mess. People would complain today. How do we explain that is still under pressure if the Earth is as old as evolutionists would claim? What's the mechanism by which that is still pressurized? Well, number 37 at the Tengiz field in the Soviet Union. This well was 14,000 feet deep, blew out 650 feet high. It self-ignited after a couple days. The oil pressure was as high as 800 atmospheres. Took them more than a year to cap. They estimate 4.7 million tons of oil and 60 billion cubic feet of natural gas blew out of that thing during that year. You look that up online, you see these guys with basically tinfoil firefighter suits trying to get close enough to the thing to work on it. You can see it in the background of this little black and white photo. Soviets don't put out a ton of pictures of this kind of thing, but it was also kind of hard to hide. It's interesting to me that the idea of uniformitarianism is addressed in the New Testament. I'll put this up and read it for you as well. 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 3 to 7. Know this first of all, that in the last days mockers will come with their mocking, following after their own lusts, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? And here's their uniformitarianism statement. For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all continues just as it was from the beginning of creation. When they maintain this, it escapes their notice that by the word of God the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water and by water, through which the world at that time was destroyed, being flooded with water. That's a catastrophe that does not fit into a uniformitarian theory. But by his word, the present heavens and earth are being reserved for fire, kept for the day of judgment and the destruction of ungodly men. Supposed difficulties for a young earth. Of course, you know my bias on this stuff is toward creationism and a young earth. And there are some issues that are brought up in opposition to that, and one of them is starlight. How is it, in a nutshell, that we are able to see stars that are hundreds of millions of light years away? Light takes a little over 8 minutes to get to here from the sun. The Milky Way is estimated to have a diameter of 100 to 200,000 light years. It's hard to know where to measure. We can only see it on edge. But I'll take the estimate there as correct. So how can these things be visible on Earth if the universe is young, if there hasn't been enough time for the light to travel? Let me give you a couple of proposed solutions. Some have suggested, Genesis, when it talks about God creating the universe, the sun, the moon, the stars, tells us that the purpose go on. The purpose was to be for mankind to see. So some folks believe that he created the light in transit. Another possibility is that the speed of light has decayed. We don't see that today, but so that's a theoretical explanation. A third, the creation week processes were different from what we see today, based like on the statement in Genesis that God caused the earth to sprout plants. That's not a process that we see today, to go from morning to evening and you've got full-fledged plants that have sprouted. Is it possible he did something like that with light? That's another suggestion. By the way, starlight, the travel of starlight is also an issue for secular scientists. If the current processes have always been, and have been in place for billions of years, we should not be able to see some of the most distant stars. If we were able to see them, they should appear to be much hotter than they are. And yet when we look out, everything looks essentially the same temperature. That's a conundrum. Thank you, John. Because the light at that temperature should not have had time to travel to us. Don't know if that argument, logic there makes sense to you, but I love the Hubble deep space photo. Essentially, the Hubble telescope, which orbits around the Earth, they took a place, it's about the size of a BB, if you hold it out at arm's length, and it was a dark place in the sky, particularly dark. And for about the exposure on the camera was about 11 days. Every time they came around to the same place, they would open it, close it, go around, open it, close it, 400 times, I believe it was. Come up with this astounding photo, and almost every item in this photo is not a star, it's a galaxy. That's why they don't look like a little round dot. They're different shapes. I'm going to zoom in on a space here in the middle just to illustrate that a little more closely. Just an absolute boatload, and yet it's not infinite, because most of the sky is dark. If it was an infinite set of stars, the sky should be light, but it's not. Wow, I'm going to get in trouble. Yeah, right. Very quickly, radiocarbon dating. We'll look at the fossil record next week. Appears to happen at a constant rate, but we don't know whether the rates fluctuate, and we don't know what the ratios were to start with. Was the beginning all 100% uranium, from which we get a decayed isotope? Observable microevolution, I would just say it's always the stuff that we can observe, changes in organisms, it's always the loss of genetic information. It's never a gain of genetic information. So when we see a new breed of dog or cat or whatever, bird, moth, that looks a little different than a parent, it's because there has been a loss of information, not a gain. That's important. Okay, I am down to my final couple points here. Creation was not observed by any human. The only eyewitness record is that of God himself. You can choose to accept it or reject it, but we don't have any humans that were witnesses of any of this. God claims to have not only seen it, but done it. There's abundant evidence today that Darwin's theory of macroevolution as a mechanism to explain life is impossible. He didn't know that, but today we do. That doesn't mean nobody believes in it anymore. But I think if you're objective about it, the theory is actually not in any way credible. There's abundant scientific evidence that the earth is young and that it was designed and created by an intelligent God. Sorry, I did my best. I would love to answer questions if you've got some. We have some soup downstairs afterward. Maybe you got a burning question that you want to bounce off me. I'm not an absolute expert on this stuff, but it is fun material, and I've had quite a bit of exposure, and there's a lot more we could say. So I got to pray before they beat down the doors. Thanks for your patience. Lord, thanks for your word. Pray that you would grant us faith to believe what it is that you have told us, and I pray too that you would give us the strength to live as you have asked us to, doing what is righteous and kind and good, and shunning evil. Help us to be salt and light in our world. In your name I pray. Amen.